I hope on your screens you are now seeing the title of your course, English Language Teaching. Am I right?
Yes, ma'am.
Right. In the class yesterday, we started discussing about this particular course, English Language Teaching, and I told you how English Language Teaching, in short, is often referred to as ELT. In the class yesterday, we took up units 1 to 4. In Unit 1, we talked about the history of English in India. We learned about the 3 important phases of the spread of English in India. We learned how, with the establishment of the East India Company, with the landing of the Christian missionaries on the Indian soil, and with various other acts of the British government, several measures were in place to introduce English into India. We looked at how English spread. We looked at the 5 stages of development of English in India with specific reference to Krishna Swami. We also looked at the 3 concentric circles as presented by Kachru. We looked at and we discussed Macaulay's minute and its significance. We also discussed Wood's dispatch. We also talked about how universities were established, how the British planned to have the regional or the vernacular language in the primary stage, how they thought of introducing English gradually from the high school, and university education was meant to be exclusively in English. We also looked at the different commissions, the different national policies, and we concentrated on the NEP 2020. In Unit 2, we continued to look at the present status of English in India. Unit 3, we talked about how to teach. Zareen Nayyar, please mute. In Unit 3, we talked about teaching of English as second language and as foreign language. And in Unit 4, we talked about teaching English language in bilingual or multilingual context. In today's class, we are going to talk about 4 units, Unit 5 to 8. The unit titles are there on your screens to see. Theories of teaching English. Then we'll have 2 units covering methods of teaching English. And in one unit, the last unit for today, we will look at the approaches of teaching English. As I quickly go through the slides, these are the slides that we discussed in the class yesterday. I'm clicking slowly so you can just take a quick look at everything. When we were talking about what you're seeing on your screen now, the different methods, grammar translation method, direct method, I had told you in the class yesterday that this unit briefly talks about each of these, and in later units we'll talk about these in detail. This is teaching of English as a foreign language. In Unit 4, we talked about all these aspects that you see reflected on your screens. Now we will move to Unit 5. The title of Unit 5, as given in your... One second. Just give me a moment. The title of Unit 5, as I told you just a little while ago, is Theories of Teaching English. In this unit, we will look at the 3 perspectives, the behaviorist perspective, the cognitive perspective, and the innate perspective. The behaviorist perspective is further divided into 2, classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So as we move ahead, we will first look at the behaviorist perspective. What is this behaviorist perspective? Behaviorist comes from behaviorism, behavior. What this theory propounds is that the way a child learns speech sounds from the time of its birth, from its close association with its family, we find similar things happening in the learning process. We do not need to tell a child everything. We don't teach the child phonetics. We don't teach the child words or sentences consciously. What happens is that the child observes and notices the things happening around. For example, when the child is hungry, it cries. When the child cries, the mother feeds the child. The child quickly learns that my crying will bring my mother close to me. The child also notices various other behavior patterns. If I do this, what happens? If I make this sound, what happens? And in general, the mother feeding the child will not keep the process silent. She will be using some gentle words. She'll be cajoling the child. She'll be talking to the child. Have some more, eat a little more, have some more. So the child begins to understand things, whatever the sounds are being uttered by the mother, by other people around the child. So this bond of association, when a behavior pattern is repeated or rewarded, has some significance. Suppose the child cries and somebody quickly comes into the room, lifts the child up and says, "Oh, what happened to you? Are you okay?" The child is beginning to associate things. Now suppose the child drops something and the parent or the caretaker uses a harsh sound. "What did you do?" "Oh no, you dropped it." Even simple words like yes, no are something that the child begins to associate. The child notices the nodding when we say yes, and the child notices the nod when we say no. So our behavior patterns, the sounds that we are using, and the action that is associated with it are things that the child is learning as behavior patterns. And the child very quickly understands, if I do good things, I'll be rewarded. If I do something bad, I may be punished. So the child learns how to act, how to understand the behavior of the adults. According to the behaviorist perspective, language learning is also very closely connected to this psychological process. So according to the behaviorists, there are two ways of looking at language learning. This is called conditioning, and therefore two models of conditioning are referred to as the classical conditioning and the operant conditioning. So remember, when we are looking at the behaviorist perspective, we are looking at two important aspects, the classical conditioning and the operant conditioning. One Russian, please stay muted. Let us look at Mubashira, please mute yourself. Thank you. Classical conditioning. Let us look and try to understand classical conditioning with a very simple example as given by the Russian psychologist Pavlov. In the course of his experiments, this Russian psychologist Pavlov used a dog. The dog was brought food. The moment the dog saw the food, there was an unconditioned response and the dog started salivating. The presence of food made the dog feel happy and it immediately responded. There was no conditioning. It felt happy. Now, after some time, there was a bell brought to the dog. The dog saw the food earlier and there was unconditioned response. It started salivating. It started feeling happy that now it is going to get some food. In the second experiment, when a bell was brought to the dog, there is no conditioned response this time also, but the dog did not salivate. It means the object food is different from the object bell. The dog knows that the bell serves no purpose. The bell is not going to mitigate its hunger, so it does not start salivating. In the next stage of experiment, the bell and the food were brought together. So the ringing of the bell and the food very detailed. The bell started ringing and the food was brought at the same time. At this stage, it was unconditioned response. The dog does not know that the ringing of the bell and the food are closely associated. Now, after some time, the dog understands that every time the bell rings, I get food also. It is not just the food coming alone, but food and the ringing of the bell are accompaniments. So after some time, what happens is, even when the food is not brought, if the dog hears the sound of the bell, the dog starts salivating. This is the conditioned process. By now, because of the behavior pattern, the dog has understood that there is an association between the ringing of the bell and food. So when the dog hears the sound of the bell, immediately the dog associates it with food. The dog knows that now food will be served, and it starts salivating even though no food has been brought. So this is a good example of classical conditioning, the experiment as actually carried out by Pavlov. Now, what does Pavlov's experiment have to do with learning language or behavior patterns among children or adults? Learning takes place due to the association and connection of stimulus and response. So, through this experiment, S stands for stimulus and R stands for response. If there is a proper stimulus, and if the subject, it could be dog, it could be child, it could be any other person, a student in a classroom situation, if they begin to associate this, then they become conditioned and they start giving responses. Earlier, when the response was unconditioned, in the second stage, the response becomes unconditioned. 1 second, please. Just give me a moment. I'll take you to the second slide. Now, under behaviorist perspective, I said there are two types of conditioning. We just looked at one, and now we are looking at the second one. In this previous slide, we talked about classical conditioning, and now we move to the operant conditioning. Here, remember the three words: stimulus, action, reward. In the previous one, you had stimulus and response. Now, take each of this: stimulus, action, reward. In these experiments, we have a hungry pigeon in a cage or a hungry bird in a cage. Inside the cage, there is a lever. If that lever is pressed, food grain falls into the cage and the pigeon can eat. The pigeon is not trained initially. There is just a hungry pigeon in a cage. It did not have any food for some time. There is a lever inside the cage, and the moment by mistake the pigeon presses the lever, the food grain comes to the aid of the pigeon. So the stimulus is the hungry pigeon in cage. The action is random pressing of the lever. This leads to a reward, and the reward is the food grain. Now, nothing is happening in the cage. In the case of the dog, the person carrying out the experiments made certain changes. First, food was offered, then bell was offered, then bell and food together. In the end, only bell was used. In this case, we just have a pigeon in a cage. It is kept hungry. The liver is already a part of the cage. The food grains are conditioned in a manner that when the liver is pressed, the food grains will fall into the cage. Initially, as the pigeon is flying, moving around the cage, by mistake, it presses the lever and it gets food grain. In the second stage of this experiment, there is a random attempt of pressing the lever. It is not conscious. The first time, it just happens by mistake. Second time, it sees that there is something here, but again, it is not conscious. There is a random attempt of pressing the lever, and again, the pigeon gets rewarded with food grains. In the third instance, what happens is, again, nobody is training the pigeon. This is self-learning. It is less random and less attempted. By now, the pigeon is getting an idea that every time I come to this particular spot of the cage, I am getting food. So what is it that is here that gets me food? So it is less random and less attempted now. Finally, the pigeon has become intelligent. It understands the association between the pressing of the lever and the food grains. So once there is a stimulus and there is an action on it, it is rewarded. So in the final stage, the clever pigeon has learned that the moment it presses the lever, it will get food. This is the operant conditioning. When we place this in the learning situation, we can again see how a child learns in a situation on its own. The teacher can give access to the student by allowing certain things to be within the reach of the child. And the child on its own will learn many things. This was the behavioristic perspective, in which the behavior of things around, the behavior of people around, or one's own behavior helped in the learning process. The pigeon learned through its own behavior that if it presses the lever, it will get food grain. The dog learned from the behavior of the bell and the food that the sounding of the bell will get me food. So it was completely behavioristic. Now we move to another perspective. This is different from behavioristic perspective. This perspective is termed cognitive perspective. What happens here? Learners, it is believed, those who propound this theory believe that learners have a cognitive map of their world that comprises all learning. There is something inside our brains that helps us to learn. So new learning experiences are assimilated in the cognitive map. We don't need to be taught. If we are taught one thing, from that one thing we move one step ahead. We are using our brains, we are using our cognitive abilities. That okay, if I do this, I'm going to get this, and from here I can move next step ahead. So the learner's ability to evaluate and comprehend new experiences is enhanced by this cognitive map that is inherent to all of us. So learning does not happen in isolation. It does not happen with association of one thing only. This is a continuous process. And every time, for example, you give the child a piece of chalk and a slate. The child eventually learns that by scribbling on the slate, the child will be able to draw some patterns, which could be drawings, which could be letters, which could be numbers. Now the child on its own may try to put things together and make meaning of whatever that scribbling is on the slate. Further, without teaching the child may now experiment of what the chalk can do besides drawing lines on the slate. The child will move around the furniture inside the home, on the walls. If you have very little kids at home, you will see the moment a child gets a pencil, a crayon or a chalk piece, they want to experiment. They want to see how they can write on the walls, on the pieces of furniture, etc. They do similar things with objects. If you have little kids, again, you can notice how they drop things on the floor to understand the different sounds being created by different objects. They also notice whether an object breaks, whether something spills when they drop it. So this is learning is a continuous process. In this experiment, a caged ape was used. An ape, a huge monkey, was kept inside a cage, and near the roof of the cage, which was high above for the ape to reach, some bananas were placed. Inside the cage, some pieces of rods were placed, rods that could be attached. Initially, when this caged ape started feeling hungry, it wanted to eat the bananas. It tried to reach the bananas, but it could not reach because they were high above. The first action of the ape is to jump. It tries jumping up and down in the cage, trying to reach the bananas. But intentionally, the height of the cage is high and the ape cannot reach the bananas. This poor hungry ape now starts thinking, the bananas are there, I can't reach them, even if I jump, I can't reach them. What next? It looks at the rods inside the cage and it gets an idea. Why don't I use this? The ape picks up one rod, tries to use it to reach the banana, it still can't reach. But there is not one rod, there is more than one rod. If you can see on your screen, it says pieces of rod. There are pieces of rods in the cage. Now this clever ape sees what it can do with all these rods. And as we say, necessity is the mother of invention. The ape, feeling hungry, wants to eat the bananas. There is a necessity. So it starts experimenting. It starts checking out if the rods can be joined. And of course, the rods are meant to be joined. So it joins the rods and successfully reaches the bananas. Nobody is training the ape, remember. Just as the pigeon was not trained, the ape is also not trained, but on its own, it has used its cognitive perspective to learn. From here, we move to the third perspective that is presented in your Unit 5, Theories of Teaching English. This is the innate perspective. Noam Chomsky is a famous linguist. He believed that people can naturally learn languages. We do not need a classroom situation. We do not need a specific syllabus to teach people languages. It is a natural talent. It is innate. It is inherent. Now, these innatives believe that a human child is born with a biological component that is called the language acquisition device. In short, it is referred to as LAD. Language acquisition device. So this device that is a part of our human body, that is a part of a biological setup, predisposes us. Mustaq Ahmed. Please mute. बहुत लेटर है वो बोला आपके पास मिल जाएगा एक ही लेटर में उनका बहुत मुश्किल है मिलना मुश्ताक अहमद will you please mute yourself बस ये दूसरा है ना please be careful we cannot have the mics getting unmuted in the course of the class. Sorry for the disturbance. Okay, so these innatives believe that children are born with an innate, inherent capacity to understand the different language patterns. When we teach a child sounds, even before we teach the child different sounds, different vowel sounds, consonant, nobody needs to be taught. In your own mother tongue, did anyone tell you these are vowel sounds, these are consonant sounds? Or if you've learned English as a first language, I'm sure in your early years of schooling, nobody came and told you that these are the different sounds of English. These are monophthongs, these are diphthongs, these are pure vowels, etc. Nobody needed to teach it to us. We learn these at a later stage. Inherently, we begin to associate sounds, the different sounds that we hear around us, and we try to make sense. That is how you see when people go to a new country, they quickly learn the language of that nation by simply noticing what happens. You go to the counter, you want to buy a burger, but you don't know that in this country it is called burger, or you don't know how to pronounce it. So you can point out to the image. The other thing that could happen is you watch people around you. You listen to people asking for burger. You listen to people at the airport, at the bus stop, and through that you begin to learn the language. From the examination point of view, I would say individually you will not get any one of this: behaviorist perspective, innate perspective. You will in general get something that is more of a comparative study. So it could be something like this. Suppose compare and contrast. How do you compare and contrast any one of these? It could be innatist and behaviorist, or it could be behaviorist and cognitive perspective. If you do get these individually, innatist, behaviorist, etc., then you will get them as short notes. Similarly, for short notes, it could be either classical conditioning or operant conditioning. Such questions may be expected in the examination. For the objective type questions, I could give you 1 or 2 sentences from your SLM. Now suppose there is a sentence in your SLM which reads, the famous Russian psychologist Pavlov's experiments are known as classical conditioning. From this one sentence, as I told you yesterday, many different types of objective type questions may be framed. Who was the dash psychologist who experimented and came up with the theory of classical conditioning? Or the name may be missing, Pavlov, his nationality Russian may be missing, or the name of the theory classical conditioning may be missing. Similarly, a question on what we looked at just now. Which one of the theories focuses on the inborn ability of children to learn a language? And from the choices, you can refer to the innate perspective or the innate theory, like that. So we now move to we now move to Unit 6. As I told you, Unit 6 and 7 both talk about the methods of teaching English. This is part 1 of the methods of teaching English. If you look at the 4 things presented on your screens, you will notice that I've already mentioned grammar translation method, direct method, and audiolingual method in the previous class yesterday. Something new that you see reflected on your screen now that is discussed in Unit 6 is Dr. West's reading method. Let us first look at grammar translation method. This was the method that we looked at in the class yesterday also. I told you that this is one of the oldest methods of teaching a language, teaching English, especially in a context like India, where English is a new language, or it was not the native language of the Indian speakers. So for a very long time, even today, there are many schools and colleges where grammar translation method is still used, though it is discouraged. But when we teach in a school that is not English medium school, if students are studying in a different medium of instruction such as Urdu medium school, Hindi medium school, Gujarati, Punjabi medium school, Marathi medium school, then invariably it becomes difficult for the teacher to use the direct method, and the grammar translation method is what is used. It becomes more appropriate also. The teacher in a grammar translation method generally uses the bilingual method so that the students can understand. Examples are largely drawn from the language of the student, the mother tongue or the local regional language, to explain to them various aspects of English. Even while this is not just while teaching grammar, even while taking up prose or poetry, the teacher may take up a passage or give the summary in the mother tongue first and then take up the lesson. Or in the course of the lesson, while giving meanings, the teacher may be using meanings not just in English to English meaning, but she may be providing the meanings for the English words in the language of the students. About direct method, also we discussed yesterday. Direct method is as the term indicates, it is direct, it is natural. We teach English in an English classroom using English as the language of communication. It is assumed that the students know English. It is also assumed that the students' ability to learn something new will help them to understand what the teacher is saying. Even if the child's language is not English, by constantly following the commands of the teacher, the student will know that when the teacher says stand up, this is her hand action and I have to stand up. With this hand action, when she says these words sit down, the child begins to associate this action and the sound sit down means that I have to sit down. Bring your book here. Once, twice, thrice. By repeated actions and observing, the child understands that this instruction is what this means in my language. While in the grammar translation method, the thinking process continues to be in the language of the child in Urdu, Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati, Telugu, Tamil, etc. In the direct method, more or less the child is thinking in English and responding in English. Even if the thinking is happening in the mother tongue, gradually the child will learn to also think in English while also speaking or writing, reading in English. About the audiolingual method, it is not very common today, but it is still used to learn a new language, especially most of the crash courses in English and Chinese and French and Russian still follow the audiolingual method. As I told you in the class yesterday, the audiolingual method was very popular during the period of the World Wars. It helped different soldiers to learn new languages when they were moving from one land to another where their own native language was not spoken. Now we look at Dr. West's reading method. This we did not discuss yesterday, so we'll spend a moment on looking at what Dr. West's reading method is. What this theorist proposes is that the child should be first taught to read the language first. First start reading in English. Then the second stage, once you can read in English, then you start learning to write in English. Later, first you have started reading, then you start writing, then you learn how to speak. And finally, in the last stage, the child is encouraged to learn to understand speech. So the speaking and the listening skills are not given any importance in West's reading method. The only skill that is given importance in West's reading method is the reading skill. First learn to read, read the language, read sentences, read words. Don't you think this is also what happens in most of our schools, especially in the primary level? Even students from Urdu medium, when they start learning English, it is not that they start learning to speak in English first. They're first taught how to read this. Or take a very good example, because many of you are from a Muslim background. As Indians, how do we know Arabic? Do we speak Arabic? No. When Arabic is spoken, are we able to understand it? No. Are we able to read Arabic? Yes, almost everyone, because the Quran is in Arabic. All of us are taught to read Arabic first. Do we learn to write Arabic? Rarely, mostly no. So this is Dr. West's reading method. He encourages everybody to start learning a language by first reading it. From here we move to the next unit. This is a continuation of the previous unit. We are still looking at the different methods of teaching English. We talked about bilingual method yesterday, the total physical response method, and the silent way method yesterday. Suggestopedia is something that is new and presented here. The bilingual method was presented by C.J. Dodson Wales. He first came up with this theory that in a classroom situation, it would be better if two languages are used. One, the target language, but because the child is not familiar with the target language, the teacher can use the source language of the child to teach the new language. So in an Urdu medium school, to teach English, a teacher of English is welcome to use Urdu and follow the bilingual method to teach English. Bilingual, as the word indicates, and as we already discussed, is using two languages. This is possible only when the teacher is good at two languages. If the teacher knows only one language, then it becomes very difficult to teach. But remember, every time there was a first learner. When the Britishers first came to India, nobody in India knew English. But the people of that generation still learnt English. Those Britishers who were interacting with the Indians, whether in Bengal through Bengali, in Punjab through Punjabi, or in any other language, were also doing it for the first time. But both the sides learned the language of the other. So bilingualism is not only possible, it is still a common means of learning process in the Indian schools and colleges. Under the NEP 2020, because once again we are going back to education through the regional language, education through the mother tongue. Bilingualism has once again become more important in the Indian educational setup. Under the total physical response method, as propounded by James Asher, I have put down the names against the methods because sometimes in the objective type questions, you may be given the names and you may be asked to write what method, or the method may be given and you may be asked to identify the theorist. All the names are there in your SLM. So in the total physical response method, it is like I told you, listening that is given importance, and all other skills, reading, writing and speaking, come later. The child is first taught through listening. Listen. They are either played cassettes, recordings, or they listen to the teacher, and then they start understanding what the teacher is trying to convey. We will look at the silent way method and then come to Suggestopedia. Silent way method is in fact a very good method, but it may not always be successful in every classroom situation. In the silent way method, as proposed by Gatengo, the teacher is expected to remain silent for most of the time in the classroom. Unfortunately, what happens in most of the Indian schools and colleges is that there is a monologue. There is the lecture method where the teacher is doing the talking, like I am doing in your classes now. So I'm not silent. I'm not giving you a chance. It is the other way around in the silent way method. The teacher remains silent most of the time. You go to an English classroom, you encourage your students. Today we are going to take up this unit, a prose lesson. Will somebody from the class, will Ahmed start reading this lesson? And Ahmed starts reading one paragraph. Then the teacher says, okay Ahmed, thank you for reading. Will Sarah please explain to us what Ahmed was reading? And then the teacher will say, okay, now James, will you read the next paragraph? And the students are encouraged to do many other things simultaneously so that they can quickly follow what is being done in the class. My personal experience tells me that yes, it is quite possible to take up the silent way method and to a very large extent also find how it is easy for, one second, just a moment. Okay, where was I? Sorry for the little disturbance. In the silent way method, because the teacher is playing a less active role, the students become more active and they're participating in the classroom process. They're participating in the language learning process because it is more interactive, because there is a lot of peer learning happening. Perhaps, and there is every possibility that when you apply this in your own classroom situation, you may find that the students are very eager to learn. But the only drawback is that if the class consists of students who are new to that segment of language learning, who do not know much about what you're teaching, then the silent way method may not work. Let us now look at the Suggestopedia method. Again, as the word Suggestopedia suggests, it comes from suggest and pedagogy. The teacher makes certain suggestions. For example, it is like associating. If the teacher wants to build up a calm, gentle atmosphere in the classroom, the teacher can make use of very soothing music in a classroom. Or she can think of introducing some kind of activity that will make the students understand that if I do this, this is what I may do. So we have suggestions and we have pedagogy. We are trying to teach through suggestion. What normally happens here is that if you, in an Indian classroom situation, our students don't just learn English. They learn at least two other languages, the regional language and one more language. Students in Telangana will study English, they will study Telugu, they also study Hindi. When more such things are happening, the teacher can think of various methods of inculcating language learning among these students. It could be the use of mother tongue and English. It could be building up a very conducive atmosphere. It could be the teacher making some suggestions or the teacher using, let us say, if you want your students to write a paragraph or an essay, instead of simply saying, write a paragraph on the important tourist places in India or write an essay on the important tourist places in India, the teacher can make certain suggestions. She can bring pictures of important historical places. She can have a chart. She can have a visual presentation, encouraging the students to learn. For the last unit of our class today, we'll quickly look at the different approaches. What are the different approaches in language learning, and can these approaches be applied in our own classroom situation? Each one of these has its own merits and demerits. In Unit 7 also, when we were talking about all these, you can first talk about what this method is, what are its principles, what are its characteristics, what are its merits, what are its demerits. Similarly, for each one of the approaches, we can also say what it is, define it, explain it, talk about the merits, talk about the demerits. Let us look at the structural approach first. In this structural approach, language is taught through structures or patterns. I'm not sure how many of you have done this, but this is a very common learning strategy employed in most language classrooms. When we teach our students sentences, you might remember the SVO pattern or the sentence structure pattern. The teacher writes a sentence on the blackboard with the subject, verb, and the object. Rama killed Ravana. Rama is the subject, killed is the verb, Ravana is the object. SVO pattern. Then the teacher encourages the student to write some more sentences similarly. Or, I ate an apple. This is given on the blackboard as an example, and the students are encouraged to build 5 or 7 more sentences in similar pattern. So the child looks at I, and it varies from child to child. One child may say, if it is I, maybe the teacher wants me to change the pronoun. And in the next sentence, the child will say you. I ate an apple. You caught a fly. So the verb bought, ate is changed to caught. Apple, object is changed to fly. Another student may think, why only a pronoun? Maybe I can use a noun in this place. After all, I have to use a subject here. The subject could be a pronoun or a noun. So the other student may write, Afrin ate an apple, or Afrin ate any other fruit, ate a mango. Like that, the child builds structures or patterns. In most of these cases, what happens is that while the child is learning to build sentences following the example sentence, the child may not be consciously learning what is it that is a subject, what is it that is a verb, what is it that is an object. Especially as the sentence structure proceeds, its level of complexity increases. Direct object, indirect object, adverbial, complement. The verb may not be one verb, it could be a phrase. The subject may not be one verb. The group of 10 girls went to the market. The subject is a phrase now, the group of 10 girls. A child in the initial stage may feel confused with this structure. Anyway, it still has certain benefits. In this situational approach, language is used in a situation. At the bank, at the airport, at the bus stop. We are using English for specific purposes. This is generally used in making adult learners learn a particular language, we create a situation. We tell them, okay, imagine you are at the bank. How will you interact with people at the bank? Excuse me, I need a checkbook. And then the person at the counter says something. Do you have a savings account or a current account? So a little dialogue is built up between the two. The teacher uses such exercises to help the students learn language in a situation. Generally, a dialogue or a conversation is given. Character A, character B. If character A says this, hello, how are you? Where are you going? Hello, I'm fine. I'm going to the hospital. So through situations, language is taught to the students or to the children. The next method, communicative approach, is much more important and more commonly used in our classrooms these days, because it is felt that the goal of language teaching is communicative competence. Like Dr. West, it is not enough if our students just learn how to read. It is not enough if they write good English. It is equally important that they speak good English, and they speak good English according to the situation. And they should be also able to listen to what the other person is saying and comprehend clearly. After MA or even before MA, if you're thinking of going abroad to especially the Western countries where English is the first language, you may be told how passing the English test is important. This could be the TOEFL test, this could be IELTS test, or any other test required by that particular institution, or even for working in that particular country. In these tests, all the 4 skills are tested: LSRW, listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Another approach, the last one, and with that we come to the end of the class. When I stop talking about the constructivist approach, I will also stop recording. Constructivist approach. It is believed that knowledge is constructed by the learner by interaction with the environment. And yes, this is very, very important. The language that is spoken in a particular region under a particular situation may not be the same language as is spoken by another set of people in a different context. People living in hilly regions will have certain language components that will be unique to their region. People living in valleys will have certain components that are unique to their language. There are certain food items, for example. This is a very simple, very common example, nothing to do with language learning. Biryani, halim. You won't find these terms in another language. Rice, yes, you have chawal in different languages. Water, yes, you have equivalent terms in different languages. Father, mother, yes, equivalent terms in different languages. But there are certain things that are very specific to the environment. And whatever knowledge we gain is through a process that the learner begins to construct on his or her own by interacting within the given environment. In an English classroom situation, depending on the environment, if the teacher goes on using the mother tongue, the child will never be encouraged to speak English. If the teacher of English feels that this English classroom is the only place where my students have access to English language, and I should give them an opportunity to speak in English, to listen to English, to read and write in English, then yes, the children will also begin to understand the importance of language, and then by interacting with the environment around them, they will also become participants in the language learning process. For now,